screen because I have some images to show you today. And I want to say thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this work. You see a slightly revised title here. I'm still playing with my framing for this project, but right now I'm working with this, I'll Fly Away, Audubon, Freedom and Flight, which evidences my continued thinking about the project's larger framing and especially how I want to think and write about slavery in this project. So this talk today is part of my book in progress, tentatively titled Animal Humanism, Race, Species, and the Child in the Long 19th Century. And in readings of literature broadly construed, I examine how various texts enact human-animal comparisons that resist rather than enforce the hierarchies of race and species that are most common to discussions of this intersection. My analysis there seeks to find progressive and sometimes even radical readings of both interracial and interspecies affective relations. And I intend this interdisciplinary project to make a kind of anti-racist intervention into the fields of human animal studies, as well as in 19th century US studies. And in human animal studies, we can see discussions of race are still very much too rare and often prioritize contemporary context, resulting in what I would like to think of as an inattention to the overlapping discourses of race and species in US and transatlantic literatures and cultures of the 18th and 19th centuries. One thing this project does is attempts to show how childhood becomes a key site for both humanization and racialization, a process that is often treated in tandem with one another in the literatures that I discuss. And so I'll talk a little bit about children's literature today. What I'm presenting comes from the final chapter of this project, in which we see a particular way that human-animal relations push against racist humanist narratives of Black resistance. And this part of the project has propelled me into the beginnings of my next, which explores early Black futurism. And I'm thinking a small part of this will consider the animal alongside the fantastical and also the eschatological as early forms of the technological apparatuses that are employed by what I'm considering as a kind of early version of Afrofuturism. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. I want to begin then with a little bit of a song.
Some glad morning when this life is on, I'll fly away, I'll fly away to that home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away, I'll fly away. Yeah, brother, I'll fly away, we'll fly. I'll fly away, I'll fly away, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away, I'll fly away. Yes, sisters, I'll fly away.
The last stanza of Paul Laurence Dunbar's 1899 poem, Sympathy, explains a bird singing not out of joy or freedom, but sorrow at its own captivity. I know why the caged bird sings, ah me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. Dunbar knows why the caged bird sings, in part because of the connections between enslavement and Black people and the captivity of animals that were so prominent in 19th century culture. Comparisons of birds and Black people hinged on discussions of relative freedom, opening avenues for human-animal comparisons and human-animal relations that were not dependent upon simply racist comparisons or dehumanization. My talk describes some of the racialized residents of birds in the long 19th century in order to explore these particular human-animal relations. These push against, I begin then with some of examples of bird-slave analogies that appear in anti-slavery children's literature. And then I'll discuss some of the writings of John James Audubon, where bird taxonomy and racial taxonomy appear in parallel. I looked at Audubon's work as a way of talking about how stories about animals and stories about non-white people converge in the early American white imagination. And I'll end my discussion by reading the racial resonance of birds in this historical context against another bird slave analogy in the flying African stories of African American folklore. Reading human-animal relations between birds and Black people within this context of enslavement and freedom across texts, we can see relations that defy more commonly discussed racist human-animal tropes and instead illustrate their potential for Black resistance to oppression. As icons of and metaphors for freedom, birds are figured in the discourses about slavery throughout the long 19th century. Because birds in particular were viewed as symbols of freedom, arguments that they should not be caged abounded in discourse on pet keeping. These arguments were sometimes coupled with abolitionist arguments against slavery, for example, in stories about children who decide to free birds from cages. John Neal's 1842 story, Instincts of Childhood, is one in which a young girl, Margaret, turns to her father's instruction about bird keeping into an anti-slavery argument. Chastising her for keeping a nuclear family of birds in separate cages, her father tells her that, quote, these birds may want their father to help feed them. The poor mother bird may want him to help take care of them or to sing to her, and to separate them just now. How would you like to have me carried off and put into another house, leaving nobody at home but your mother to watch over you and the rest of my little birds? As Margaret tries to care for the birds herself, she notices that they remain unhappy, and he continues, may it not be the very things you speak of, things which you think ought to make them happy, that are the very cause of all the trouble you see? The father and mother are separated. How can they teach their young to fly in that cage? How teach them to provide for themselves? Margaret eventually frees the birds, but when she applies the same logic to a Black enslaved woman who her parents have separated from her husband, her father shows that his analogy between bird and human families does not extend to Black people. After listening to her parents' decision, Margaret gestures towards the cage. Her father tells her that she does not understand adult matters. Suppose I were silly enough to open my doors and turn this poor thing adrift with her child at her breast. What would become of her? Who would take care of her? Who would feed her? He asks. And young Margaret replies, who feeds all the young ravens, father? Who takes care of all the white mothers and all the white babies we see? And then, how can they teach their little ones to fly in a cage? How teach their young to provide for themselves? Margaret's uncomfortable father ignores her as the story closes, sending her off to bed. But to Neal's young readers, we're meant to understand her childlike wisdom. Putting aside Margaret's useful analogy in effect, Margaret's father argues that although birds should be free, Black people should not. And Neal's comparison of birds and enslaved people takes up this common pro-slavery argument that enslaved people ought to be enslaved because they, unlike birds, he would say, are incapable of caring for themselves. Similar comparisons between free birds and unfree Black people were voiced in other anti-slavery children's literature, which used birds' freedom as a marker for human aspiration. Hannah and Mary Townsend's 1847, The Anti-Slavery Alphabet, makes a similar comparison. E is the eagle soaring high, an emblem of the free. But while we chain our brother man, our type he cannot be. On the same page, we see not freedom, but flight, as F is the heart-sick fugitive, the slave who runs away and travels through the dreary night, but hide himself by day. Eliza Lee Cabot Follen's poem, The Little Slave's Wish, from her 1846 collection, Hymns, Songs, and Fables, puts this comparison into the mouth of an enslaved child who says, I wish I was that little bird up in the bright blue sky that sings and flies just where he will, and no one asks him why. This sentiment of wishing for bird-like freedom is extended also into later contexts and would appear in places like Polly Greenberg's 1968 picture book, Oh Lord, I Wish I Was a Buzzard, a story of children's labor, originally told by Gladys Henton of Green Mill, Mississippi, and recorded by the Child Development Group of Mississippi's efforts to create literature explicitly for rural Black children. I'll return to other African American children's literary contexts for this sentiment a little bit later. So birds ought to be free because their very nature wills this freedom, these texts argue, and similar arguments about Black people would appear throughout anti-slavery writing. Such arguments draw upon essentialist notions of race and species. The quality of flight was often presented as evidence of birds' inherent unfitness for captivity. That is, why humans ought not to keep these animals caged. The anti-slavery arguments above further depend upon exceptionalism, as animal welfare advocates of the mid to late 19th century would decry only certain animals, like birds and squirrels, as inappropriate pets, but others, like dogs and cats, as well suited for this form of captive domestication. Much is the same with discourses on human freedom. Comparing enslaved Black people to birds, then, was an alternative to comparing them to different kinds of animals, like mules or horses, who could be made to work, or to dogs, who were supposedly loyal pet companions for which loving masters were stewards. This anti-slavery discourse was dependent upon human-animal relations that were here observed as species-specific racialized relations. In both this white anti-slavery context and in Dunbar's poem, with which I begin, we see racialized resonances of birds as either free or caged. And from the sum of these readings, we can see that birds do not figure as universal emblems of freedom, but as animals that can be racialized along lines of freedom and captivity in these 19th century contexts. Here we see birds differently racialized, framed not as an emblem of universal freedom, but rather of ersatz freedom. This bird takes the form of Columbia, aligned with the United States nation and occupying an adversarial relation to enslaved Black people. These images appeared on the cover of the American Anti-Slavery Almanac for 1843 and 1844, published by the American Anti-Slavery Society and edited by Lydia Maria Child. And also on the page, the title page of William Wells Brown's 1848 songbook, The Anti-Slavery Harp. The bird here is predatory, as an American eagle seems about to attack a Black woman who shields her child from the violent reach of its beak and talons. These anti-slavery publications display the bird as an ironically disingenuous icon of freedom. When Black men, women, and children were legally enslaved under a federally sanctioned system of oppression, the bird may not appear only as idealistic, but also as an adversary, a violent predator, rather than a paragon of freedom or a fellow captive. Differently oriented connections between birds and slavery appear in one of the most iconic studies of birds, John James Audubon's 1831 ornithological biography, a companion text of captions for his illustrated The Birds of the United States of America. Audubon's writing gives not only descriptions of the birds that he represents, but also an account of the fieldwork involved in bird collection and taxonomy, showing what Christopher Iannini has called the, quote, rich interplay between ethnology and ornithology. Recognizing Audubon's self-racialization as an inherent part of his ornithological taxonomization, Iannini writes that, quote, Audubon is both subject and object of the ethnological gaze, taxonomist of racial multiplicity and living embodiment of it. Essential to Audubon's task of ornithological organization is the capture and killing of these birds, and his narratives of such have resonance for human captivity and violence via enslavement. The ornithological narrative is an apt place for reflecting on early 19th century discourse of slavery because of the symbolic resonance of freedom that birds carry, both in natural history and in anti-slavery writing. As Audubon's narrative of animal study merges with the ethnographic, however, his text places the story of US plantation enslavement alongside one humanizing birds' nobility under captivity. Among other things, John James Audubon was a Kentucky enslaver. One episode in his ornithological biography, The Runaway, makes his pro-slavery position apparent. His descriptions of the birds of America are, quote, interspersed with delineations of American scenery and manners, and The Runaway is one of many episodes that recount travels and collection of the birds that he represents. This story, like many of Audubon's stories, is highly suspect, but I'm interested here not in its veracity, but in its literary qualities. While hunting in the woods, hunting wood ibises in the Louisiana swamps, Audubon encounters a Black man who has legally emancipated himself and his family from slavery. This man, who Audubon never names, carries Audubon's bag of dead birds to his own home, and he and his family dry Audubon's clothes, feed him and his dog Plato, and shelter him for the night. Audubon writes that he, quote, perceived in them a strong desire to make me their confidant and friend. Ultimately, Audubon frames himself as these people's benefactor, believing that one and all seemed to regard me as one sent by Providence to relieve them of all their troubles. Seemingly oblivious to the reasons people attempted to escape slavery, Audubon asks this man, why? You have left your quarters where certainly you must have fared better than in these unwholesome swamps. The fugitive man tells a common story, explaining that he and his family had been sold away from one another. His wife sent more than 100 miles away, and their 3 children dispersed to different places, apart from both one another and from their parents. The man has escaped and freed his wife and children in succession. With help from the local enslaved community, they had obtained the means to settle in the swamp and provide for themselves initially, but they've had difficulties finding enough game for food. The couple, rather inexplicably again, I'm skeptical of many parts of this story, asks Audubon for help. Good master, for God's sake, do something for us and our children, they sobbed forth with one accord, Audubon writes. Despite the hospitality he has received in their temporary home, at the end of the story, Audubon's pro-slavery logic takes full effect. He takes them back to the home of their first enslaver, with whom Audubon tells us he himself is well acquainted, and who greets him with all the generous kindness of a Louisiana planter. He writes most beneficently, I scarcely doubted of obtaining their full pardon. Audubon thereby assists in the entire family's re-enslavement, noting that the enslaver, quote, afterward repurchased them from their owners and treated them with his former kindness, so that they were rendered as happy as slaves generally are in that country. Indeed. Audubon notes at the end of this chapter, quote, since this event happened, it has, I have been informed, become illegal to separate slave families without their consent. But he provides no further comment on the matter. This story of a Black family who cannot provide for themselves and therefore requires an enslaver to do so repeats the same pro-slavery logic as the father in Neal's children's story. White people's ignorance about enslaved people's close ties to family is an oft-cited problem in abolitionist literature. Anti-slavery arguments that would respond to this pro-slavery rhetoric by exposing the myth of the kind master, suggesting that the fact of enslavement, rather than its conditions, are actually what matters. While the ornithological biography includes various episodes from Audubon's travels, this story about the Runaway it seems an odd inclusion. It's not a story about birds, though it's a story about bird hunting and perhaps racialized labor. Neal's telling of the familiar story about enslaved family separation through the story of caged birds shows how birds operated in antebellum discourses of captivity and freedom, like Audubon's. While Neal uses the resonance of birds' associations with captivity and freedom to an anti-slavery purpose that will be perceptible to his child audience, Audubon's bird book contains a discussion of race-based human slavery as mundane, and Runaway is just one instance. Interestingly, his chapter on the golden eagle is another. Before giving his description of this bird, Audubon discusses the events obtaining and killing one such specimen. Rather than capturing this bird in the wild, as he does thousands of others, he purchases this one from an acquaintance. Already a commodity, this bird stands out from the many others Audubon describes, and we never see it in a state of freedom, only caged. Here Audubon takes up associations between birds and freedom, alongside the particular problem of his own practices of collection and preservation. He writes, at times, I was half inclined to restore him to his freedom, that he might return to his native mountains. Nay, I several times thought how pleasing it would be to see him spread out his broad wings and sail away toward the rocks of his wild haunts. But then, reader, someone seemed to whisper that I ought to take the portrait of the magnificent bird, and I abandoned the more generous design of setting him at his liberty, for the express purpose of showing you his semblance. We should note that Audubon does not encounter this moral dilemma with the Black human fugitives he helps to re-enslave, nor does he with the other birds that he captures and kills. This bird is exceptional in Audubon's narrative, and its exceptionality aligns with the transatlantic trope of the noble slave. Gendering the bird as he, despite the fact that the description of the final illustrated plate lists it clearly as an American female, Audubon's anthropomorphizing characterizes the bird much like a human captive. He describes the noble bird as having a deep, bold, and stern eye and giving looks of proud disdain at his capture. Even facing his death, one Audubon has considerable difficulty achieving, the noble bird continued to stand erect and to look defiance at us whenever we approached his post of martyrdom, we read. This noble species, he says, is the majesty of the king of birds. But of course, this bird must die so that he and his story can be preserved. First trying but failing to asphyxiate the bird by burning charcoal, Audubon, quote, thrust a long pointed piece of steel through his heart when my proud prisoner instantly fell dead without even ruffling a feather. While not as gory, say, as the death of Orinoco, this chapter is difficult to read, particularly because of this bird's humanization, which also reads as a racialization in the context of its exceptional nobility and captivity. Audubon's references to slavery are reinforced by the larger project of crafting his own public persona as an authoritative taxonomer, a project that includes racializing himself as white. As Gregory Nobles has shown in his 2017 biography, John James Audubon's project of self-fashioning depended largely upon making himself into the kind of person who could become a successful and iconic authority on birds in the United States in the 19th century. This fashioning was decidedly racialized. Born under circumstances that Audubon either himself could not or would not relate consistently, the autobiographical narrative that he would write later conformed more closely to available literary genres than to the historical record. Jean-Jacques Audubon was born in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. He had mixed-race half-siblings, at least one of whom passed by white by becoming associated with the white mother that Audubon himself claimed, rather than the mixed-race woman that Audubon père had abandoned in Saint-Domingue. I intend to position this chapter of my book in a larger section containing John James Audubon in a discussion of some writing by Paul Belloni de Chailloux, framed by the mixed-race taxonomies of whitening that work to humanize their non-human subjects and frame their own human-animal relations. Both of these men were instrumental to the taxonomy of species, and both were of at least somewhat ambiguous racial origins. Du Chailloux was a French-American explorer and travel writer, like Audubon somewhat, who was credited with having confirmed both the existence of the gorilla and the pygmy ethnic group of Africa for white Western scientists. Sources vary exactly as to when and where Du Chailloux was born. Some say New York, some say Paris, some say Louisiana. The most likely of these is the island of Réunion, just east of Madagascar. And his father was a white French trader, although even during his life, he was rumored to have had a mother of African descent. And so Audubon and Du Chailloux's work of animal collection and classification simultaneously worked in tandem to classify these animal collectors themselves, distancing themselves from the places of their birth. And their participation in the scientific work of non-human species categorization thereby helped to solidify their respective places in white America. Audubon becomes American not by birth, but by adopting the nation as his own in acts of careful self-crafting that legitimize his position as a white person and thereby strengthened his opportunities in a white supremacist nation and the perceived value of his work worldwide. I'm less interested here in whether these rumors of mixed-race mothers are true, although these stories are very much of 19th century genres that interest me, than I am in the connections that these rumors raise about the relationships between these men's work of animal taxonomy and their own racialization. The work of collecting and categorizing animals was part of the larger Euro-American project of imperialism, and non-white people assisted in the labor of collection, and their local knowledge was essential to Euro-American knowledge production about animals with which white people had been previously unfamiliar. Additionally, the scientific discourse produced by this collection and taxonomy of various species of animals fed into larger systems of white supremacist human-animal hierarchy. Animal identification and categorization involved and contributed to the usual practices of imperialist exploitation. As a significant part of white supremacist systems, the scientific practices helped to produce racist scientific beliefs, which also depended upon racist notions of who was and who wasn't a legitimate contributor to scientific knowledge. In the cases of Audubon and Du Chaillu, rumors of non-white heritage circulated that these men functioned as figures who contributed to the realm of scientific knowledge only because they were largely believed by the majority of their contemporaries. Thus, their participation in scientific categorization also depended upon their categorization as white, which happened in part due to their establishment as icons of scientific exploration, collection, and taxonomization. And I look to these men's biographies in racial identification because they make clear one way in which race mattered for 19th century discussions of species. In both self-making and bird-making, we can see how taxonomy is not just a process of classification, but also of creation. In 1818, Audubon apparently played a prank on North American naturalist Constantine S. Rafinesque, in which he invented a number of animals, including several rats and fishes and 2 birds. Rafinesque later described many of these animals in the 1820 Annals of Nature, or Annual Synopsis of New Genera and Species of Animals in North America, and the birds are described by color and size, attributed as having been sighted by Mr. Audubon. Rafinesque also speculates about their birds' habitats and origin. One, he writes, is a solitary and very wild bird. The other, he argues, must have been a wanderer. It is probably a native of Louisiana or Mexico. As he became a decidedly American public figure, many supposed Audubon himself to have been a native of Louisiana, as some obituaries and biographies would report. The relationship between myth and truth is sometimes a matter of perspective rather than veracity. Audubon's ornithological positioning within relation to birds and slavery might be countered by that of a different ornithologist, the Canadian Alexander Milton Ross. Sometimes called the Birdman, he used his work to travel freely in the US South as a cover for networking with enslaved people as an agent of the Underground Railroad. Ross wrote in his 1893 Memoirs of a Reformer that he had during his childhood gained a heritage of qualities which have been ruling factors in all my labors for the betterment of humanity, a love of nature and a love of freedom. But the extent to which Ross, an abolitionist who was most oriented to white abolitionism in ways that hinted more at stewardship than equality, may serve as a kind of counter to Audubon's enslaver ornithology, and is therefore a bit limited, I think. I've just begun exploring a different kind of counter to Audubon's ornithology in African-American artist Kerry James Marshall's 2020 Black and Part Black Birds of America series, inspired by both Audubon's potentially part Black genealogy and Marshall's own encounter with a crow. And so now I want to turn to a coupling of nature and freedom that holds the animal and the emancipated human, not in stewardship, but in embodiment. The juxtaposition of literary culture and historical myth-making that I've outlined so far takes us beyond the realm of metaphorical likeness, with which so many human-animal comparisons begin and end. My interest is not only a comparison, but also a relation. In other parts of this project, I translate this quite literally to discuss human-animal relationships that are also racialized relationships. For example, in the dissonance between dogs used to hunt enslaved people and enslaved people's own pet-keeping practices. And here I expand human-animal relations to encompass something that I understand as evoking human-animal resemblance and resonance that's part of a larger system of simultaneous truth-telling and race-making. The Flying African Folk Story presents one such human-animal resemblance and resonance that merits further considerations along these lines. Though often articulated as a metaphorical likeness, what if we took it seriously, this mythic Black embodiment of bird-like freedom and flight? If we look to the racialized resonances of flight, we might better understand human-animal relations, resemblances, and resonance as racialized relations within this larger context of human and animal captivity. Flying Africans' folktales were passed down by family members over the course of the 19th century and later recorded by American folklorists in collections that include the Georgia Writers Project, a local unit of the Federal Writers Project, 1940 Drums and Shadows, Survival Studies Among the Georgia Coastal Negroes, John Bennett's 1946, Doctor to the Dead, Grotesque Legends and Folk Tales of Old Charleston, Langston Hughes and Audubon Thompson, 1958, The Book of Negro Folklore, Richard Dorson's 1967, American Negro Folk Tales, and J. Mason Brewer's 1968, American Negro Folklore. Different versions of this story would be retold and reimagined in African American poetry, art, film, and literature for both children and adults throughout the 20th and into the 21st centuries. This story is believed to have its roots in the event of the Igbo slave rebellion on St. Simons Island in Glynn County, Georgia. In 1803, a group of people who had been kidnapped from West Africa in what is now Nigeria were brought by ship to Savannah. Following their sail, some of these people were taken on a smaller ship headed to Simons Island. On this ship, the enslaved people rebelled against their captors. What exactly happened is unclear. Stories vary. But the Black people overthrew and drowned the crew, running the ship aground in Dunbar Creek. They themselves escaped the vessel into the swamp, either to drown themselves or perhaps not. Some accounts relate that the people committed collective suicide rather than remain enslaved, as we know some African captives did over the course of slavery's Middle Passage. Some accounts say that at least some of the captives fled into the swamp to other Black communities of fugitives there. And other accounts report that the people rose up, literally turning themselves into birds, perhaps vultures or buzzards, and taking flight back to Africa. Over the next 2 centuries, Black people would tell and retell the story of their ancestors in bondage who escaped by flying away. In her 1977 novel, Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison's characters recount a version of the popular folk tale. Susan Bird tells Milkman Dead, "Some of those Africans they brought over here as slaves could fly. A lot of them flew back to Africa." When you say flew off, you mean he ran away, don't you? Escaped? No, I mean flew. Oh, it's just foolishness, you know, but according to the story, he wasn't running away. He was flying. He flew, you know, like a bird. What about this aspect of the story? Its specific reference to avian flight is so compelling. US literature and folklore abounds with stories of self-emancipated people in anti-slavery literature, personal narratives, poetry, fiction, and research pieced together from the historical archive. It's easy to understand why stories of self-emancipation more broadly compel us and why we should continue to tell and retell them. They're interesting and exciting, and moreover, they are uplifting and strengthening to those of us whose legacies of racialization have been affected by the history of chattel slavery. But this particular narrative of emancipation as flight does additional cultural work. Whether a story of emancipation and evasion, or emancipation through suicide, what trajectories through life or death might the image of the bird offer? The Flying African story evokes a bird as a figure, an emblem of freedom, and also draws upon the bodily qualities and movement of these animals. In some versions of the story, an old man invokes African language and magic, calling the other enslaved people to recall their flying abilities and ultimately rising up himself to guide them away. In their discussion of African American folk tales, Henry Louis Gates and Maria Tater describe this figure as having a bird-like role, writing, "Like the lead bird in a migratory formation, he brings them back home." Birds in this story evoke the ability to fly as well as transatlantic movement that is ultimately seasonal rather than perennial. The non-permanence of migratory movement may then be the hinge upon which this bird-like flight returns. The hope that kidnapped forced laborers might look to an inevitable return to the land of their ancestors was the draw of this particular narrative. Not just emancipation, but return is the crux of the Flying African tale, whether that be a physical bodily return to Africa or an ancestral reunion to one's spiritual home in death, as many writers imagine freedom's possibilities of enslaved people as only otherworldly. The song with which I began, "I'll Fly Away," was written by Alfred E. Brumley, a white shape note singer, in 1929. The recording I played was performed by the Salah Jubilee Singers, a Black gospel quartet performed during the 1930s and 40s. Connections between the shape note singing tradition with which Brumley has been associated and the genres of both white and Black spirituals have been explored to some extent. And the Library of Congress's article on African American spirituals, for example, cites a 1943 recording of the Lincoln Park Singers singing I'll Fly Away in order to connect the white and Black versions of this musical genre. While I've not found clear documentation of I'll Fly Away having any roots in the history of Black spirituals, the thematic and generic connections are clear. The song's origin speaks to further these racialized connections. Accounts of Brumley's composition have been describe his apparent inspiration for the song, based on his own work in his family's cotton fields in the early 20th century. As the story behind the song in the St. Augustine Record describes it, it was in 1929 that Brumley actually composed I'll Fly Away. He recalled that he was picking cotton and singing a popular song, If I Had the Wings of an Angel. Suddenly, he thought about flying away. He later said, actually, I was dreaming of flying away from that cotton field when I wrote I'll Fly Away. However, the song took on a spiritual meaning. While this and other accounts don't seem to locate Brumley's inspiration in the Black spiritual genre, the accounts he gives of imagining flying away from a cotton field is uncanny, and it is racialized. Although Brumley picked cotton on his family farm that they owned during his youth, cotton picking has a racialized labor history in the United States, performed by Black sharecroppers and before them, of course, by enslaved Black people. The song has been further connected to enslaved people in imaginings about enslaved resistance. In a discussion of African American people's connections to Africa, Geneva Smitherton locates the song much earlier than Brumley's supposed composition, imagining that enslaved Africans kept thinking and hoping all the way up until the 19th century that they would one day return to Mother Africa. Some hummed a tune, I'll Fly Away, believing that, like the legendary hero Solomon, they would be able to fly back to Africa. And other popular culture accounts credit Black musical traditions with the song in a kind of matter-of-fact way that's not accompanied by the kinds of citation that an oral or oral tradition often cannot produce. I've not yet found an account in which Brumley himself directly credits Black musical traditions for this song, but his account of cotton picking inspiration broaches that connection. And one hardly needs to stretch the imagination to picture instead of Brumley an enslaved cotton picker, pausing to contemplate flight. The ease of re-racialization in this story is what makes suggestions of Brumley's adapted or borrowed or lifted or straight up stolen song from a Black spiritual tradition plausible. And the history of complexly intersecting influences between white and Black music, the accompanying history of white appropriation of Black musical and other art forms can't be separated. Like Audubon, Brumley is a figure whose whiteness is ancillary to his images of flight, which also evokes racialized human-animal connections. But regardless of the song's origins, later Black uses of I'll Fly Away seem appropriate precisely because of the underlying connection between Blackness and birdness in these kinds of racialized stories about flight and captivity that I write about here. We could trace this forward through the history of its uses in African American music, in gospel recordings. Anthony Heilbut's The Gospel Sound, for example, includes an account of the song being sung by J. Robert Bradley at Mahalia Jackson's funeral in Chicago. We might then trace this through a longer thread of African American music. But music is just one place where we might trace this theme of Black flight, and another prominent location is children's literature. So I end my discussion with a turn to more recent Black children's literature to show how childhood remains an essential site for these human-animal connections. And these narratives show how Black writers have framed discussions of captivity and birds around freedom and flight, coupling human and animal imagery in their imagining of Black fantastic futures. The flying African story, as a staple for Black folklore and its retelling, has repeatedly found its way into children's literature. In the afterword to his 1869 children's collection, Black Folk Tales, Julius Lester describes the oral history of the flying African tale and locates it regionally around the place where the original flight was to have taken place, writing that it was once common to hear this story throughout the coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia. Lester goes on to recount written sources for the story, suggesting also that both of these sources and his readers might take the story seriously. He notes that sources for the Federal Writers Project and Drums and Shadows refer to it constantly as if it were fact. It may be. This last sentence of his suggests the fantastical possibility of the story's veracity. One might initially argue that the fantastical nature of the story is the thing most likely to call into question its veracity. But if we consider other popular fantastical stories, like on the third day he rose again, we might rather come to understand that the real reason some may question this story is because it is a Black story, told primarily by and for Black people. Both Blackness and Birdness are essential for considering the story's fantastical future. In her version of the story, Virginia Hamilton writes, "They say the people could fly, say that long ago in Africa, some people knew magic, and they would walk upon the air like climbing up a gauge, and they flew like blackbirds over the fields, black, shiny wings flapping against the blue up there." The blackness is not incidental, but signals blackness with a capital B. It's inextricable from these histories of enslaved Black people, metaphorical flight, and symbolic birds in the movement of freedom. Caesar Grant's version of the story, in All God's Children Had Wings, begins with a similarly fantastical, racialized human bird figure. Once all Africans could fly like birds, but owing to their many transgressions, their wings were taken away. There they remained here and there, in the sea islands and out of the way places in the low country, some who had been overlooked and had retained the power of flight, though they looked like other men. Enslaved and overworked, it is a woman who is forced back into the field while also tending her child, who first rises up out of slavery and into flight. An old man, also working in the field, gives her the signal when it is time, saying, "Yes, daughter, the time has come. Go, and peace be with you." And he stretched out his arm toward her, so. With that, she leapt straight into the air and was gone, like a bird, flying over field and wood. One by one, in response to the overseer's increasing violence, others follow, and at each also leaped up and was gone through the air, flying like a bird over field and wood. And eventually, the power of flight returns to all. The old man speaks to them, and they each recall this power. We read finally that all the Negroes, old and new, stood up together. The old man raised his hands, and they all leaped into the air with a great shout, and in a moment were gone, flying like a flock of crows over a field, over the fence, and over the top of the wood, and behind them flew the old man. This flock of crows also includes children, and the woman who leads the flight rises up along with her child, quote, "gone with her babe astraddle on her hip, sucking her breast." The others also take flight with their children, and as the story closes, we read that those who had children gave them their breast, and the children laughed and sucked as their mothers flew and were not afraid. In a discussion of speculative fiction, Michelle Commander describes Afro-Atlantic speculation as a series of imaginings, envisioning return flights back to Africa by which African descendants might return, belong, and feel free. The speculative imaginings of this story decidedly include children in the story of Black Atlantic flight. The illustrations for Virginia Hamilton's picture book, illustrated by Leo and Diane Dillon, show an intergenerational community of Black people in flight, from carried infants to older children holding hands with each other and with adults as they fly on their own. These images of flight are fantastical imaginings dependent upon images of the non-human and also of childhood. 3 winged features appear on the book's title page, the smallest of whom is a short-winged child with a bowed head, all with arms outstretched, perhaps to take flight, but also in a gesture of welcoming to the book's young readers as they are invited into this narrative of Black history. At the close of her folktale, Hamilton draws attention to its preservation in print, explaining that while not all enslaved people could fly away to freedom, the story ends not with flight, but with its continual retelling. She says, quote, "They say that the children of the ones who could not fly told their children, and now me, I have told it to you." The postscript explains the story's place in the long history of Black folklore, articulating also the compelling nature of the fantastical. Like Julius Lester's account, she notes, it almost makes us believe that the people could fly. In the retelling of the story, it is the fantastical that is reinforced. And Hamilton reminds readers that the story is a testament to the millions of slaves who never had the opportunity to fly away. They remained slaves, as did their children. but she tells us the people who could fly was first told and retold by those who had only their imaginations to set them free. Black storytelling is a vehicle that continues to deliver historical Black diasporic stories to future children that they too may appreciate and perhaps see themselves in this fantastical tale that provides hope even in the face of oppression. And the Flying African story, like folk stories more generally, are the purview of adults and children alike. Children have always continued to be a key component, though, of articulations of Black humanity and imagining Black futures. And children have always been considered and included in Black communities and movements for resistance. This connection of fight and flight evokes not just the possibility of freedom, but also this history of captivity. It looks both forward towards these aspirational goals and backwards towards suffering that sparks their motivation. Birds suggest a willful resistance against being contained, either in Audubon's magnificent golden eagle, who proves so difficult to kill, or in Dunbar's caged bird, singing with bruised wing and sore bosom from beating itself against the bars of its cage and pleading upward for access to flight. Birds hold their own yearnings for bodily and perhaps even psychic preservation. Lore about Black people could fly, thereby return to Africa, continually evokes bird imagery that must be taken seriously in these larger cultural contexts of racialized human-animal relations in the transatlantic world. And like birds, flying Africans defy captivity and rise up to the sky in order to escape the oppression of plantation slavery on the ground. In arguments that extend beyond the question of Black humanity, we can see human-animal relations that extend not only towards dehumanization, but also these kinds of radical Black futures, thinking not just in terms of humanism, but at times the supernatural, the fantastic, maybe even the eschatological, allows for a fuller exploration of early Black forward-looking trajectories of freedom and flight.
Great. Thank you very much. So we do have a comment and more of a, a question as well. Our viewer Diane says, your descriptions are breathtaking. I've heard many cruel and ugly descriptions of slavery, but find your comparisons especially sad. Is this a common reaction? What kinds of reactions have you gotten from audiences to your work and observations?
Thanks very much for that question. Teaching literatures that are about oppression, I've often come across this difficulty in conversation with students who I'm teaching, and talking about not only the intellectual labor, but also the emotional labor of doing this work, of reading these texts, I think is really important to just understanding how we go about this work. And that labor too is also racialized labor. And so thinking about what our own individual embodied relationships to the various histories of oppression that we're reading about, even if we're not reading racist texts, but anti-racist texts that are just describing racism, as many African-American texts do, we have to be able to attend, I think, to the emotional content of that labor. And that's something that I think is not often overtly recognized in conversations that are about the intellectual parts of this, but that is, I think, a really essential part of what this work is for researchers.
Great. Let's see. Let me see. Another Marie had asked, you mentioned some specific birds. But there was a tendency to identify emancipation with a particular type of bird, songbirds, for instance, in contrast to the eagle imagery you showed as an adversary to blacks. I guess, could you comment a little bit more on that?
Yes. So, songbirds are really prominent in this kind of, in anti-slavery children's literature, or in children's literature generally. In all these discourses about pet keeping, songbirds are the kind of birds that I think most often people are trying to keep as pets. And in questions about whether they should do that, often talks about, this kinds of birds. But I do often see other kinds of birds in this kind of literature. We could think of crows also in a piece that's kind of related to, but a little bit separate from this project. I'm writing a little bit about an early African-American children's periodical published in the early 20th century, the Brownies book, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, for one, who that included a column called "As the Crow Flies," that gives a kind of anthropomorphized bird as a kind of local and foreign news correspondent, and has some interesting racialized implications, I think, that work a little bit differently, and that plays really interestingly in ways that are specific to crows, much maligned birds, but birds that have been known to be very, very clever. And so, we see different kinds of birds, I think, operating in different, different pieces of this. But oftentimes, too, the birds might also not be identified in these very specific ways. And so, as with animal taxonomization in lots of 19th century moments, like dealing with primates, for example, there sometimes isn't other details about what kinds of birds people are imagining. And so some of this is at times left a bit open for us.
Great, thank you. And actually that leads to another, our next question. You were kind of starting to talk a little bit about it, but someone had asked, can you talk about other analogies between animals and enslaved people by white people, or as inspiration to the enslaved?
Okay. Yeah, so, elsewhere in this book, I talk about a few different human-animal relations in which slavery, matters pretty clearly. And in one section of the project, I talk about dogs. And so dogs operate in a few different ways in anti-slavery literature. One way is as hunting dogs used to hunt self-emancipated people. And this is a Caribbean as well as a US context, but we see them in popular anti-slavery fiction. We see them, in stage play versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin and in other places, but dogs used in what Sarah E. Johnson calls canine warfare, to hunt Black people, especially Black self-emancipated people. It is a long, really interesting history of dog training that one can then trace forward to something like the use of police dogs in the 20th and 21st century, for example. But dogs also operate in these stories in ways that enslaved people might compare their treatment to being treated like dogs. And so we sometimes see in anti-slavery texts in enslaved people and dogs aligned as mistreated by white enslavers. So in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe's famous anti-slavery novel, George Harris's enslaver drowns his dog and tries to force him to drown the dog. And he describes having to watch his dog drowned to his wife. And this is kind of the impetus for him running away. And so we have an alignment in a very, very different way between enslaved people and pets, in an instance like that. And so, this is going to look a little bit different when we think about the kinds of patronizing stewardship with which enslavers regarded enslaved people, kind of similarly to pets. And that's something that's going to extend, not only to enslavers, but also to white abolitionists. And so models of pet keeping and stewardship, kind of seep into anti-slavery literature as well, as they, kind of frame exactly the problem that Neil's story is telling us, that like ideas that Black people need white people to take care of them in some way. And we can see kind of similar, ways that anti-slavery arguments might apply even to those anti-slavery contexts as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's interesting. That really, it's really interesting to see kind of the different ways that that's portrayed with. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but it is very interesting. So I don't know that we have any other questions. See if any other pop up here. Great. Well, no, again, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and also thank you for a really wonderful presentation. And I hope you have a good evening.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good night, everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.